And as we speak, there are crowds rallying outside Downing Street. We've just got these pictures in, which were taken nearby. Police are now wearing riot gear. Police dogs are patrolling. The mood has changed. We cannot confirm whether any arrests have been made. It has been the most extraordinary day. A day which has seen, I've never seen so many white people in one place. It's an extraordinary story. There are people everywhere. There are crowds everywhere. We're back tomorrow night, 6:30, but until then, that was meant to be Brexit Day. We leave you with some images of the day it actually was and how we got here. That's Channel 4 News.
Well, there you have it. He's never seen so many white people in one place. And he, the man making this statement, is Jon Snow, the anchor of Channel 4 News here in the UK. And Channel 4, for those abroad, is the third largest broadcaster in the country. And Snow has presented the news on Channel 4 since 1989. And what a telling statement that here, in the United Kingdom, a union comprised of England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, countries where the indigenous people are of European descent, a news anchor for a leading broadcaster has never seen so many of these people in one place. But let's get this out of the way first. His comment was clearly anti-white, but it was also interesting, and for two reasons. The first and most obvious is, of course, that here in a European country, this news anchor has essentially admitted what we have been saying all along. White people are becoming a minority. And not only do we know this is a fact, but we also know that this fact isn't a secret. Population experts admit it. The government admits it. And even the media have admitted it. In fact, they've even got a date set for when white British people will be a minority in the UK. That date is 2060, just over 40 years from now. I read this from the Daily Mail, and I quote, "R.I.P. this Britain. With academic objectivity, Oxford professor and population expert David Coleman says white Britons could be in the minority by the 2060s, or sooner," end quote. And 2060 might sound like a long way away, a time in the distant future. And because of that, whites becoming a minority in 2060 is something that the establishment doesn't want you to worry about. But whites becoming a minority doesn't just happen overnight. It's something that takes time, as it's a gradual process, or maybe not such a gradual process, depending on where you live in the country. But clearly, the state of the UK has already declined to a point where a leading newscaster is dismayed to see so many white people in one place. He's confused by this. Maybe he works in London though, as London is already a city where white British people are a minority. It's a city overrun by migrants. And just to underline that point, I read this from Wikipedia, and I quote, "At the 2011 census, London had a population of 8,173,941 people. Of this number, 44.9% were white British. 37% of the population were born outside of the UK, including 24.5% born outside of Europe." End quote. And that was 2011, and white Britons only made up 44.9% of the population of London back then. So now, in 2019, the situation is far worse. So maybe Jon Snow doesn't see white people so often. Maybe he isn't used to seeing large homogeneous groups of the indigenous people of these islands. Maybe that was why all these white people being in the same place was so shocking to him. But that quickly takes us on to the second point. And this is the bit where we not only look at what he said, but the way in which he said it. He not only seems to be dismayed, but I think there seems to be another important implication. It's almost like he thinks that the fact the crowds are white is a bad thing. One can only speculate, but it appears as if he thinks that the fact that the crowd is white should be seen as a negative, almost as if the term white is being used as a disparaging adjective, as something that should make viewers react in horror. Oh my, the streets of London were filled with white people. How awful. And I think that's very important and very telling. And it's at this point we have to stop, take stock of this comment, and ask ourselves, what would have happened to a newscaster who had been reporting on an event in an African nation and exclaimed in a disparaging way that he had never seen so many black people? Do you think that newscaster would still have their job? I don't. I also think that newscaster would have been mocked and derided, and the logical question would be asked, why would it be surprising, or indeed bad, to see Africans in Africa? The whole of social media would have rounded against someone making such a comment, and jumped to the defence of those being disparaged. But when this happens to white people, it's a different matter though. And I would go as far as to say that we Europeans are the only ethnic group that the media would dare to treat in this way. And this isn't the only time a major broadcaster has acted in this way. In 2001, the BBC's then Director General Greg Dyke called the corporation hideously white. I read this from The Guardian, and I quote, "Director General admits BBC is hideously white. The BBC is hideously white according to Greg Dyke, the corporation's Director General." End quote. Hideously white? Can you imagine the Director General, or in fact anyone working within Britain's state broadcaster, using the word hideous to describe another ethnic group? Or that it was hideous for another ethnic group to be dominant in a certain field or pursuit? Can you imagine someone at the BBC calling a basketball team hideously black? The outrage would be heard around the world, and the individual would be sacked immediately. But Greg Dyke wasn't sacked. Oh, and you may want to look up the ethnicity of Mr. Dyke, but don't be too shocked when you uncover just another coincidence. And importantly, this is a window into the world of the media, a media that hates white people. But the media doesn't just hate white people, the media also hates Brexit. And I know they hate Brexit because it was people voting against internationalism, and they can't tolerate that. They also hate Brexit because it was a nation standing up against a globalist superstate. Brexit was a nation demanding independence and sovereignty. But they also hate Brexit for another reason. And I think this very telling little clip exposes that. They hate Brexit because Brexit was an example of white people rebelling against the system. And that's just something that the establishment can't stand. In March of 2018, the leader of the Liberal Democrats bemoaned the following, and I quote, "Brexit. Too many older Leave voters nostalgic for white Britain," says Cable. Too many older people who voted for Brexit were driven by nostalgia for a world where faces were white, Sir Vince Cable has said. End quote. Because those of European descent wanting to be around their own people and wanting to immerse themselves in their own culture is absolutely abhorrent to the establishment. The same establishment that builds community centres for every other culture, ethnicity and religion. The same establishment that funds Afro-Caribbean carnivals, Diwali celebrations, and releases fawning press statements at the end of Ramadan can't stand white people having a community or acting as a group. But white people did act as a group. They voted to leave the EU as both an endorsement of Britain as an independent nation, but also as a protest against mass immigration and multiculturalism. And now the government and the media is desperately trying to deny those people what was promised to them. 17.4 million people who voted to leave are being stabbed in the back by the politicians. And because of that, last weekend, tens of thousands of protesters flooded into London to make their voices heard and demand that the government honours the promise they made to the people when they initiated the in-out referendum that took place in 2016. But the thing that the government hates most about these pro-Brexit protesters, the thing the media can't stand, is that the crowds are white. These protests are overwhelmingly made up of white people. White people standing up for their own nation, their own interests, and against mass migration. Because ultimately, the media and the treasonous politicians hate seeing those of European descent organising as a group and campaigning for their own well-being. And the sight of tens of thousands of white people marching through Britain's multicultural capital, demanding that their nation be freed from the tentacles of the Marxist EU superstate, is something that makes these internationalists livid. But it makes them feel something else too. It makes them fear. They fear that there is some fight left in us. They fear that they haven't beaten us just yet. And they fear that we may still rise up and take charge of our own destiny. And that gives me hope. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please help spread the message by liking and sharing it on social networks. If you want to hear more from me, please hit the subscribe button as new videos are posted every week. You can also read my book, The Fall of Western Man. It's available as a free ebook and in both hardback and paperback, and all the links are in the description below. Finally, if you want to join in the discussion with me, feel free to add me on Facebook and follow me on Twitter. Also, you can now follow me on Gab, Minds and BitChute as well. Everyone's welcome.